Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the AccountsAdvanced Academy and Charity Funds Worksheet. We've got half an hour to talk to you about that today. My name is Tom Jeffrey. I'm one of the Education and Media Technicians here at Caseware UK, and I'm joined by Les Horsley, one of our EMT consultants. So Les is going to be taking you through the presentation today. There'll be plenty of opportunities for you to submit your questions. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. If you have a question, please pop it into the question field in the GoToWebinar control panel. We won't be using the hand raising feature today because there's quite a few of you with us, so we won't be monitoring that. But if you have any questions, pop them in the question field. Get back to you as soon as we can. If we don't get back to you during the session, don't worry. We'll get back to you directly after the webinar. We're also going to be publishing the Q&A document with the recording of the webinar on the knowledge base. So before I hand over to Les, I'd just like to run a quick poll just to gauge some feedback from you. So we have a poll which is, I'm just going to pop up on the screen now, just to find out what your level of experience is with the AccountsAdvanced Charity and Academy Funds worksheet. That's in AccountsAdvanced as opposed to the previous V3 template. So if you're new to preparing these kinds of accounts altogether, if you've used it in this template, but you would like to find out more about it, or if you're more familiar with the V3 version and you'd just like to know what the differences are between the two. I'll just give you a few more seconds to submit your answers there. Okay, so I'm going to pop the results on the screen. Quite interesting, actually. So, Les, we've got, it looks like the majority that answer 45% have used the V3 template. We've got 30% saying that they used this version before, but they just like to know more. And actually 25% saying that they're new to producing charity and academy accounts. So I'm going to hide the results there, and I'll hand you over to Les, and we'll get started with the agenda and the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you ever so much for Tom for that introduction. As Tom says, my name is Les Horsley. I'm one of the Education and Media Consultants here at Caseware. So we're here to talk about the Funds Worksheet. So a few things to actually sort of go through on the agenda. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to start off just by sort of perhaps just giving you a little bit of an overview as to the purpose of the Funds Worksheet, just to explain why it's actually there in your Caseware files, because this Funds Worksheet is specific to that charity and academy accounts production. So if you're preparing accounts for, say, companies or maybe pension schemes, you won't necessarily see that Funds Worksheet there. It's really for charities and academies. So just explain why it's actually there in those types of files. Once we've done that, we'll actually just give a very, very brief overview as the Funds Worksheet, just to explain the overall sort of broad sort of structure, just to sort of explain the different sections. But once we've done that, obviously we can actually then sort of delve into the actual worksheet itself, and a number of different areas we need to look at in the worksheet. So in terms of specific worksheet sections, the first three are hopefully listed on your screen in front of you. So we'll just explain the first section, which explains or looks at some of the disclosures, I should say, if you do actually have any sort of pension reserves in your set of accounts. Once we've done that and actually looked at that section, we'll actually have a look at the sections which deal with expenditure on charitable activities. So in terms of the expenditure that your charity or also academy, so what I'm actually saying in terms of charities also applies for academies, but in terms of the actual expenditure incurred, the Funds Worksheet will provide some additional refinements to the information currently contained in the map numbers in your Caseware file. So we look at what you need to do to actually complete the required details in terms of expenditure. Then we can actually look at trading accounts, and obviously charities nowadays often have trading accounts to actually generate additional income, additional resources for them to use in pursuit of their charitable aims. Possibly, I guess, even academies as well might also have sort of trading accounts to supplement their sort of like the Department of Education funding. And we look at how this trading account section in the Funds Worksheet works to again ensure the correct disclosures in your financial statements. What you will find is those sort of three sections potentially impact on lots of different areas in terms of your notes, but the final sort of 2 sections really sort of focus on perhaps 1 or 2 specific disclosures. So moving on in terms of specific worksheet sections, we'll look at the sort of 4th section, which just deals with movement of funds. And really that movement in funds section just deals with sort of perhaps some sort of specific disclosures in your set of accounts. So as a charity, also as an academy, you will potentially have a number of different funds that you have in your financial statements. Those funds can be unrestricted funds, maybe sort of like earmarked where you actually have sort of designated funds, or just general funds available. Alternatively, you might actually have a number of different types of restricted funds, either sort of like specific restricted funds or just endowment funds. But in terms of the actual analysis of items in those individual funds, you will need to complete the funds worksheet to ensure the correct disclosures there. And then moving on, again, in terms of the actual disclosure in your set of accounts, you might find that you need to prepare analysis of net assets. And again, the information in that note on analysis of net assets, which you have a screenshot in front of you, again, sort of feeds through from the funds worksheet. So that's the areas we're going to have a look at in our sort of funds worksheet. Just to quickly show you, I'm sure probably many of you are aware of this, but if I just quickly go to a PDF, I'm just going to come up my PowerPoint slide. You should see a PDF in front of you. That PDF is effectively the set of accounts for our financial statements of the case study we're looking at. So we're looking at a charity file today. But in terms of our PDF, as a recap, you can sort of see in terms of our sort of statement of financial activities, there's lots of information there where income and expenditure is actually broken down by different fund types, and those fund types are highlighted by the different colours there. And certainly lots of notes. So if you look at our note from income from charitable activities, again, you can see, as well as providing a breakdown of income, that income is broken down by different types of funds. And I think I've already sort of shown you as a screenshot, but again, if I just scroll towards the bottom of the financial statements, actually have a look at our sort of statement of funds, you can sort of see that statement of funds provides lots of additional disclosures, which aren't really there in maybe sort of like the equivalent set of accounts for, say, a company or a pension scheme. But because you do actually have those additional disclosures, Caseware has specific map numbers for charity and academy files to actually provide those disclosures. But in addition to the actual information providing those map numbers, the funds analysis worksheet allows you to actually provide additional refinements, additional information to prepare the financial figures. So that's a very, very brief overview of a sort of set of financial statements for a charity or academy, and just really why we actually need the funds worksheet, because those disclosures in that charity file or the academy file are quite distinct and quite different to any other sort of set of accounts, really. So that's the sort of like charity financial statements. I'm just going to quickly go back into PowerPoint. And final bit on the agenda, we'll quickly have a brief look, because I know sort of some of you sort of said in the poll that you are quite interested in actually looking at the difference between the old version of the funds worksheet and new version. So right at the end of our sort of session, we'll actually have a quick overview of the sort of different types of worksheets. Now, we've had a brief look at our sort of financial statements for a charity. And in terms of charity, a lot of that information is actually derived from the mapping, which is different for preparing a set of accounts for a company. So in terms of mapping, you're hopefully familiar with the fact in terms of the mapping structure. If you have map numbers starting with A all the way down to H, those items effectively appear in your balance sheet or your statement of financial position. But the difference in a charity and academy file is, in addition to those map numbers, you will find you actually have sort of charitable funds which actually have sort of J map numbers. And on the income and expenditure side, you also have mainly K numbers and Y map numbers to actually identify the different types of income and expenditure, but potentially you'll be using N map numbers if you do actually have sort of trading accounts for your organisation. If we look at the sort of J map numbers, you can see in terms of J map numbers that are available, we can sort of see is actually sort of like map numbers to identify the actual fund balances brought forward, and possibly any sort of transfers in, transfers out for each individual fund. But you notice there's only sort of like fairly limited map numbers there, so don't actually identify any income and expenditure. And effectively, those J map numbers that we have just seen, will actually identify and actually sort of provide information. For example, in this statement of funds, you can see in terms of our general fund number 1 here, the information in that row is actually just picked up from map number J11.01. In terms of the balance brought forward or any sort of transfers in and out, as we just seen in the previous slide, the map numbers provide some of that information if you look at the last element, that last pair of numbers. But the reason why we're here today is actually look at the income and expenditure against those specific funds and possibly any sort of gains or losses. But that income and expenditure is supplemented information containing the map numbers, and that income and expenditure per specific fund, as an example, is actually picked up from the funds worksheet, which we're actually looking at. It's a similar thing if we actually look at the K and Y map numbers. So if I just move on to my next slide, you can sort of see in terms, in this case, our K map numbers, the first three elements, the first three digits, level 1, I suppose, the mapping structure, identifies a different type of income or potentially a different type of expenditure, but also that third digit, which is actually shown in sort of red, effectively shows the income and expenditure by different activity types. So if it's activity 1, it'd be K21, activity 2 would be K22. As well as that, the middle pair of digits, those digits shown in blue, actually identify the specific types of income or specific type of expenditure. But if we look at the right hand side, those final pair of digits actually shown in green, you can see that those elements provide information on income expenditure by fund type. But what is not available, which is why the funds worksheet allows you to actually refine this information, the funds worksheet allows you to actually break down income expenditure by individual funds rather than the actual general fund type that the K and Y map numbers actually provide. And so that's why the funds worksheet actually exists. As a recap, I've actually sort of touched on the sort of like the actual sort of mapping structure there. I'm not actually going to talk in any detail about the mapping structure, but I would actually refer you to the previous webinar which we just did, which explains how the actual mapping works in the Charity and Academy files and a little bit more detail. So go to that webinar on our Caseware knowledge base, or alternatively, I think if you actually look at the handouts, you can also see, as well as a link to that webinar, there's also a link to our Getting Started guides for Charity and Academy files. So that's really why the funds worksheet actually is there for you to complete when you actually prepare sort of charity accounts. So we talked about that, just giving you a little bit of an overview. I'm actually going to sort of start the actual look at details. So I'm actually going to go to my sort of Caseware file. And so if I just come out of this and go into my Caseware file, and it's the actual trust file, which we saw that PDF just now. But once I've actually gone to that sort of Caseware file, we need to access the funds worksheet if I need to prepare a set of accounts which provide the appropriate information. To access that worksheet is quite straightforward. Basically, you just need to go to the wizard button. So if I open up the wizard button, I can just have a look at the information contained in my wizard. And then once I'm actually in the wizard, if I just go to the general information part of the wizard using the sort of tabs at the top, I really want to go to the right hand side in that sort of funds tab. Once I've gone to that funds tab, if I scroll down, you can sort of see right at the bottom, I actually have the option to actually open up this funds analysis worksheet. So I'm just going to click on the open button, and you'll sort of see the funds worksheet will actually open up. And just give it a second so to actually open up. So once it has opened up, you can see that the actual worksheet has 5 sort of separate sections, which I have actually hinted at in the agenda. So you can see the first section deals with pension reserves, which we'll look at in a minute. And then we actually have a section on expenditure on charitable activities. We can actually then look at trading accounts, and sections 4 and 5 just provide some additional information, which does actually sort of populate some specific notes. Those sections are contained in folders, and you can see I can either open up each folder individually using the folder button on the left-hand side, or probably a little bit more convenient, I suppose, if I just use the option at the top where I can just choose the option to actually expand all folders. Once I've expanded all folders, I'm just in this webinar just going to go through each section, just give you a little bit of an overview really as to why they're there and what they actually sort of do. And the first one deals with pension reserves, and it's not just the pension reserve balance, it does actually ask you to provide information on actual income and expenditure in relation to those pension reserves. I guess typically that's going to be those people who are actually preparing accounts for academies will be using this information, because obviously teachers will be perhaps part of the local government pension scheme or teachers pension scheme, which tends to be a defined benefit scheme where you do actually have pension reserves. But certainly in terms of the clients I've actually come across who actually sort of work for Caseware, A lot of charities also actually have defined benefits pension schemes, although obviously not all of them. Now, if you actually have any sort of pension reserves, and as you can sort of see from the guidance here, those pension reserves are mapped to HO3.1. You just need to identify whether those pension reserves are actually in relation to unrestricted or potentially restricted funds, but also in terms of any sort of pension income or pension costs. Again, we can just split between different fund type. And as you can sort of see, is actually a sort of drop-down menu where it says select appropriate fund type for pension reserve. At the moment, it's actually set as unrestricted. You can sort of see all my pension costs in my case, or obviously would actually also include pension income. We've got £423,000 worth of costs. I've actually sort of rounded these figures to nearest thousand. At the moment, I'm actually saying that all those costs actually are in relation to unrestricted funds. But it doesn't have to be. So I guess particularly for an academy, if I click on that drop-down menu, a lot of the academy funding is actually in relation to restricted funds. So you might actually sort of find that your defined benefits costs, again, are actually in relation to restricted funds. I think I might have said unrestricted funds just now, but where you have, for example, sort of teachers' pension scheme costs, those pension scheme costs are quite likely to be in relation to restricted funds. Or potentially, I guess, if you actually have a mixture of funds, you can see I do actually have a sort of drop-down menu. And if I just choose both in this drop-down menu, that £423,000 worth of costs, which I've actually incurred in this charity file, I can just use that blue box to actually sort of split that cost between either restricted funds or unrestricted funds. So just very, very quickly, if I just type in maybe sort of say minus £100,000 here, and perhaps £100,000 of my sort of pension costs are in relation to those restricted funds. So that's how you can actually amend that information. I'm just going to return it back to default. So I'm just going to keep it as a very, very sort of simple case study. Just say that all my pension costs are in relation to unrestricted funds, and then sort of just click on the sort of drop-down menu and just sort of say that yes, all those costs are unrestricted funds.
Les, sorry to interrupt you. There's a quick question while we're on that section. What would happen if we had it set to both? And we didn't complete the fields there, if we left the cells blank?
I think it's just something to be very, very careful of, basically, in terms of this section, but probably in sort of general terms, the actual worksheet as a whole. If you don't complete this sort of section, you will actually end up with sort of potentially sort of rounding differences or perhaps missing balances in your financial statements. So if you just change that drop-down menu to actually sort of say there's actually both, please make sure you do actually sort of like complete the box and just don't leave it blank. Otherwise, rounding differences will potentially occur in your financial statements. So it's actually sort of a fairly valid point there.
Thanks.
Okay, cheers, thanks, Tom. And that probably sort of like the same also applies this next section here. So you can sort of see in terms of both the current year and also our prior year costs, as well as actually saying where those costs actually are in relation to restricted or unrestricted funds. Potentially we might need to actually analyse our expenditure to actually break down those expenditure costs as either direct costs or support costs. And so it's exactly the sort of same thing where we actually have, in this case, I'll just choose the prior year figures at 163,000. At the moment, the default is that the Caseware assumes that £163,000 worth of pension costs are actually direct costs. But I guess if some of it actually relates to some of the support costs in your organisation, if it's maybe sort of support staff in an academy, we can just split that 163k between sort of like direct costs and support costs if I do need to do so. So really, that's the first section in this funds worksheet, the actual sort of pension reserve. And the rest of the worksheet really sort of like is a similar sort of theme. So we're just providing some additional information. And in section 2, we can just provide some information on expenditure on charitable activities. Now, you might recall from the sort of PowerPoint slides we've just run through, in terms of expenditure on charitable activities, a lot of the information for the direct costs or perhaps the support costs, so where maybe, for example, you have Y6 or Y7 map numbers, the third digit in the mapping structure allows you to actually analyse that expenditure across the actual different activity types. So if I scroll down here, you can see in terms of our charity, we actually have a number of different activities here. It's obviously a children's charity, so you can see we actually run educational classes or fun days or adventure days as appropriate. And most income can actually be analysed across those activities by using the third digit in the mapping structure. So if it's Y61, it'll be educational classes, Y62 will be sort of children fun days. Now, the thing is, though, what you need to do in terms of disclosing a set of accounts is you might need to find, you will find that you need to sort of disclose fundraising costs or governance costs or even pension costs sort of separately. And because you actually have that fundraising costs analysis and governance cost analysis as a separate map number, and so you can see if I scroll right in this worksheet, if you actually have fundraising costs, if they're direct costs, you can see if you look at the column on the right hand side, fundraising costs have map number Y6F. It'll be Y7F if it's actually support cost in relation to fundraising, and similarly if you actually have governance costs, it'd be either Y6G or Y6 or Y7G if it's governance costs, but because you're using that sort of third digit to be either F or G to actually indicate fundraising or governance costs, Caseware doesn't actually know in terms of disclosure of expenditure or activities how that activity is incurred in relation to the actual different activities. So it knows it's fundraising costs or governance costs, but it actually doesn't actually have the information to break it down by activity. So in this section here, we can just provide that analysis. So for example, if I actually have pension costs here, that 423,000, which we've been looking at the moment, sort of Caseware as a sort of default assumes that's actually all in relation to activity 1, which in our case is educational classes. And I can just, for example, say that actually £100,000 of that actually, not 100,000, £100,000 of that actually relates to sort of fun days, or perhaps even sort of 20,000 might actually relate to adventure days. And so that allows you to break down our pension costs and also our fundraising costs and governance costs across those various different activities to provide the correct disclosure in your set of accounts. Now, as you can see, I've actually just manually analysed that. You can, if you want, actually use what's called allocations table at the top of this section. So rather than just manually type figures in, I've got this option here to actually sort of choose these allocations tables. As a default, I've only got one allocation. I could maybe sort of choose 2 separate allocations. An allocation 1 might be sort of by across, sort of say, floor area. And I could, for example, say in terms of my total floor area might be sort of say 2,000 square meters. And of that 2,000 square meters, fun days might be sort of say 500 meters, adventure days might be sort of 250 meters. And as you can sort of see, the balance is educational classes 1250. Alternatively, rather than floor area, I might actually break it down as a percentage of staff costs and make that as a percentage rather than number. And in terms of my sort of percentages, again, I could, for example, sort of say that children's fun days is maybe sort of say 25% of sort of staff costs, and family awareness courses might be, I don't know, maybe sort of say 25% of sort of staff costs. And once I've provided the allocations tables, if I go down to the current year allocations method, rather than actually sort of type data in, you can see in this drop down menu here, I can actually choose allocation method A to actually allocate our sort of pensions cost. Or alternatively, I might actually use allocations method B here if I want to use a percentage of staff cost to actually allocate those pensions costs. And that allows me to actually just analyse those pension costs, or as I said, the fundraising costs or governance costs across the various different activities, because that information is supplementary to information to the actual details contained in the map numbers. In terms of this structure, you can see we actually have a sort of table here for the current year. And in that current year, we can actually analyse pensions costs and fundraising costs and governance costs, both direct costs, which actually have Y6 map numbers. But if I sort of scroll down, I can repeat that for indirect costs, and which actually have a Y7 map number, and we need to complete that for both the current years and also the prior years. So there's a number of different areas we actually need to complete, but just please make sure you actually go through and actually complete all areas as appropriate to ensure you have the correct disclosures in your set of accounts. Scrolling down towards the end of section 2, we do actually have some sort of supplementary information, so you can see where I've actually allocated my pension costs by different types of activities. In the very first section, I can actually, if I chose the option to actually sort of say some of my pension costs are mix between restricted and unrestricted funds, in this sort of supplementary table here, I can just provide that breakdown in this sort of section. And also the sort of same in terms of fundraising costs. So you can sort of see in terms of fundraising costs, at the moment, we've got £306,000 worth of fundraising costs, which are all classified as educational activities, and I can just break that down by the different fund types in this table here. That £306,000 is just fed through from the sort of sections above. So that's sort of section 2 in terms of our sort of trading accounts section in terms of expenditure on governance. Moving on to the next section, which is in trading accounts. I was getting slightly ahead of myself there. Section 3 just deals with trading accounts information. And again, it's providing information, refined information contained within the map numbers. So you can see in terms of trading accounts, if you have maybe a sort of trading account, perhaps say a sort of cafe or retail outlet, providing additional resources, that income and expenditure, which actually is linked to end map numbers, we can break it down by type of fund. And again, we have a drop-down menu, and you can see the default here is actually say that all the income and all the expenditure is actually in relation to unrestricted funds, but I have a drop-down menu, and I can just provide a sort of like the details there to actually say it's possibly either maybe sort of say restricted funds in total, or again, if I just choose the option that drop-down menu to actually say it's actually sort of mixed, that income and also the expenditure from those different trading accounts, again, I can just identify effectively what type of fund that income and expenditure actually relates to. So again, it just provides small refinements to the actual information contained within the mapping numbers. Just to avoid any confusion, I'm just going to sort of change that back to be unrestricted funds. And then once we've done that, we can actually move down to the fourth section where we can actually look at the specific fund information itself. And the four sections, again, there's a number of different areas, but those areas effectively are listing all the different funds that you actually have in your organisation. So you can see in terms of statement of movement in funds, which feeds note form, and obviously that impacts on sort of balance sheet information, other information, where we have unrestricted funds, so potentially sort of designated funds, which doesn't apply in this case, but in our case, we actually have one sort of single general fund. We need to analyse the income and expenditure. And that income and expenditure figures, so you can see in terms of income into unrestricted funds, we have 95k, around about 96k, 91k's worth of expenditure. That information, that total there, that control total feeds through partly from the mapping numbers where we got information on say Y61 or Y71, but also will actually partially feed through from the sort of tables we actually completed above. So where we actually analyse our fundraising costs and governance costs, potentially the actual analysis there might potentially also impact on the actual income and expenditure control totals shown in that red box here. But we know in total the income going into our general funds is actually 95k from both the mapping numbers and also the previous sections. If we had more than one general fund, I can just analyse that income across those general funds. In my case, I've only got one general fund here, so that 95619 I can say actually entirely relates to general fund number 1. And similarly, the expenditure, we only got one general fund, so that expenditure, that 91k, again, I can say is actually in relation to sort of general fund number 1. And the same with transfers in and any sort of transfers out. So we've got £1,000 of sort of transfer in, and then transfers out, and sorry, not transfers out, I shouldn't have said gains and losses, so excuse me on that one. So that gains and losses, again, that £1,000 I can say is actually general fund number 1. And then provided my typing is correct, so I can just type in the correct figures. You should find that that red warning here in terms of our general fund section actually has now sort of disappeared. And if I scroll down, you can see I will need to repeat this. So you can see we have some restricted funds in this charity, and that restricted fund income and expenditure, again, we just need to analyse out across those different types of restricted funds. Slightly different in this case because we do actually have sort of 2 restricted funds actually set up. I'm just going to keep things nice and simple in this sort of like webinar and actually say that all that expenditure income, that 4199 is actually in terms of fund number 1, and the same with expenditure, that £4,000 of expenditure, again, is actually sort of like all in relation to fund number 1, but obviously I can split out if I think that's actually appropriate to do so. And then once I've done that, obviously, if you look at the very first section where I actually had to transfer into our general fund, we have a corresponding transfer out. And again, just to keep things relatively simple, that £1,000 of transfers out, I'm actually going to say is actually in relation to restricted fund number 1. And again, once I've done that, again, that red warning disappears. Once I actually know that the completed table here, actually the overall, in totality agrees the actual control totals. So that's why we have our section 4, where we actually have our sort of statement of movement in funds, just sort of supplementing the information containing the map numbers from the actual previous sections we've completed, but other information we actually know in terms of our charity or academy. And then finally moving on, we just need to provide our analysis of net assets. So we actually know that in terms of net assets, we've got 3.5k of net assets. And I'm just going to keep things simple and actually say that all that 3.5k, 3596 is actually in relation to our sort of current assets there. I've actually sort of typed in just the wrong number, so I just need to amend that. And again, once we've done that, that's our sort of rounding difference and red warning actually sort of removed. So that really is an overview of the funds worksheet within this sort of charity file within the AccountsAdvanced template. Almost out of time, so I'll just very, very quickly show you the old sort of template. And once we've gone to an old charity file in the old template, I've actually sort of just gone back to the old sort of funds worksheet, which is actually used to actually provide disclosures and the old reporting standards. And effectively, the difference between them, the first three sections here provide a lot more details, or ask you to actually provide a lot more details on both income and expenditure to actually provide information in a set of accounts. And the reason why that is actually there in the old template, it's actually not there in the new template, is because if you recall the mapping structures for K and map numbers, we have 5 options if you look at last element. So last element, that last pair of numbers start off with 01 all the way through to 05, which actually are specific type of funds. And the old template, you also had the option to actually use 00, which means that that income or expenditure is actually in relation to any type of fund. And if you use 00, we had these sort of first 3 sections here in the old sort of V3 funds worksheet to actually provide the disclosure information required to actually complete your set of accounts. Because in the new template, you can't use 00, a lot of the information, apart from fundraising, governance costs and pension costs, as we just saw, a lot of the information on income expenditure is actually earmarked by a specific fund type. And so those first 3 sections, the old funds worksheet, are no longer required because you can't use 00 as a mapping number. And that really completes our webinar. We've only got sort of 30 minutes, but I hope you sort of found it useful. At this point, hopefully you sort of still got questions. If you have questions, then please feel free to raise them in the webinar control panel. But at this point, I'll pass you back to Tom.
Thank you, Les. We've got some questions that have come in. I'll just ask you a quick question. Unfortunately, the remainder of the questions we'll need to come back to you afterwards, but there will be the Q&A document. Keep sending them in and we'll certainly get back to you with an answer. But just a quick question. If you set the rounding option at the top, so at the top of the funds worksheet document there, you've got the rounding option to round to ones, thousands or millions. Do you need to set it manually in the accounts document and vice versa, or will it mirror the selection?
No, it's a good point, and again, something I didn't really sort of have a chance to actually sort of mention, but you do actually have the option at the top of the funds worksheet to actually round to nearest 1,000, which I did sort of say how I had selected. If you have rounded the funds worksheet to nearest 1,000, obviously you just also need to make sure you need to do it manually, but go in the accounts document and also make sure it's actually rounded to the nearest 1,000 in the accounts document. Again, obviously if you round to the nearest million, which is possible, I guess, in some of the larger academies, or perhaps for smaller charities, you actually show figures to the nearest whole pound. Again, make sure that the pound option or the million button option, rounding button, is actually chosen in the accounts document, but also in the funds worksheet, so they both mirror each other. They won't actually sort of switch automatically. If you change one, the other one won't change. You will need to change both manually.
Okay, thank you. As I say, out of time for more questions live, I'm afraid, but I see that you're sending them in, so that's great, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with the answers to those. So we'll move on to the next slide there, and just to point out really that we have got quite a few previous webinars, as you can see there. You can watch those on the knowledge base. But we're also in the process of uploading a lot of those to YouTube. So if you go to the Caseware Client Services YouTube channel, you'll see them appear on there. That moves sort of brings us on to the upcoming webinars. We've got quite a busy schedule of webinars coming up. So if you go to the events page of our website, caseware.co.uk, you'll see a lot more than the 4 that we've put there, but we put the next 4 for you. And as you can see, sort of in relation to what we've been talking about today, if you're using the Academy or Charity template, then we're going to be bringing you some tips on editing the trustees report and legal and admin documents. That's on the 21st of May. So if you go to the events page of our website, you can register there and you can view the agendas for those. So that brings us to the end of the broadcast today. Thank you for joining us. We have overrun slightly, so thank you for your time. And keep an eye out for the recording of the webinar on the knowledge base if you want to rewatch it, and we'll have it on YouTube soon for you as well. And we'll get back to you with answers to your questions. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.